she called in tears. Catherine did not pick up. And just like that, a silence that had been growing for years suddenly felt final. That is the moment people keep coming back to. Not a public fight. Not a dramatic statement on camera. Not a royal balcony scene. Just one call. One reported attempt to break through years of distance. And on the other side of it, nothing. No answer. No message. No softening. Just silence. Today we are diving into what many people believe was one of the clearest signs yet that the divide between Meghan and Catherine may no longer be a passing family strain, but something much deeper. Something colder. Something that had been building for a long time behind polite smiles, careful appearances, and the polished front the royal family is known for. According to accounts repeated by commentators, journalists, and palace watchers, this was not some casual check-in. This was described as a carefully chosen moment. Meghan, by several reports, did not reach out lightly. The call was said to carry emotion, urgency, and the feeling that time was running out on any real chance of repair. And Catherine refused it. That is why this moment landed so hard. Because in most families, a missed call can mean anything. Someone was busy. Someone needed space. Someone planned to call back later. But this is not most families. This is a family where silence has always carried weight, and where doing nothing can say more than speaking ever could. That is what makes this story so gripping. People are not just reacting to the idea of one woman ignoring another woman's call. They are reacting to what the silence seemed to represent. A line being drawn. A boundary being protected. A message sent without a single word spoken. And once people started looking at it that way, the whole story changed. Because then the call was no longer just about emotion. It became about power. Position. Timing. The monarchy itself. Whispers around royal circles had already been growing before this moment. There had been quiet talk of deepening distance, of old trust never being rebuilt, of private efforts that either failed or never truly began. By the time this reported call happened, many people watching the royal family already had the sense that whatever had once been damaged had never really healed. This only seemed to confirm it. What many people don't know is that these kinds of moments rarely stand alone in royal life. They arrive after months, sometimes years, of tension forming in silence. A short exchange, or in this case no exchange at all, becomes powerful because of everything sitting underneath it. And there was a lot sitting underneath this one. For years, the public had been shown different versions of Meghan and Catherine. At times they were presented as two women trying to make difficult roles work inside a very rigid system. At other times they were framed as complete opposites, almost symbols of two different worlds. Catherine was often seen as calm, measured, and deeply aligned with royal duty. She looked like someone who understood the rules, even when those rules demanded sacrifice. Meghan, on the other hand, was often portrayed as more open, more expressive, and less willing to shrink herself to fit a structure that already existed long before she arrived. That contrast followed them everywhere. And once a contrast like that takes hold in public imagination, every small act starts to feel bigger than it is. A look lasts too long. A greeting feels too cold. A missed call becomes a headline-sized symbol. But there was something else here too. This reported call came at a time when the royal family was already under pressure. Public scrutiny was high. Internal strain was already being discussed. Emotions, by many accounts, were running close to the surface even if no one inside the institution would ever say that aloud. So people immediately started asking the same question: why now? Why would Meghan choose that particular moment to reach out? Some believe it was sincere. A final effort. A private attempt to clear the air before things became truly irreversible. Others saw it differently. They wondered if the timing made the gesture harder to receive, especially in a system where every move is examined for its wider effect. That tension, sincerity versus strategy, is one reason this story refuses to go away. Because the truth is, both things can exist at once. A person can feel real emotion and still be judged through a political lens. A call can be personal for one side and deeply complicated for the other. And nowhere is that more true than inside the monarchy, where private feeling and public meaning are almost impossible to separate. So Catherine's refusal, as many insiders framed it, did not look impulsive. It looked intentional. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just firm. And firm can be devastating. Especially if the person calling believed there was still one last opening. That is the part that gives this whole story its emotional pull. Because if Meghan truly believed this was a final chance to be heard, then the silence on the other end was not just rejection. It was closure handed down without a conversation. A shut door. And once that image took hold, it spread fast. Royal commentators started reading the moment less as a family disagreement and more as an institutional choice. They pointed to Catherine's evolving role, the growing seriousness of her position, and the fact that by now she is not simply a senior royal woman trying to manage difficult relationships. She is increasingly seen as part of the future backbone of the crown. That changes everything. Because from that angle, refusing the call was not just a personal decision. It was a decision shaped by duty, caution, and the monarchy's long habit of protecting itself first. But there's more to this story. Because a silence like this does not become so powerful unless something had already been breaking long before the phone ever rang. And that is where the real backstory begins. Long before this reported call, long before people started talking about final divides and doors closing for good, the distance between Meghan and Catherine had already become its own quiet story. It did not begin with one dramatic explosion. That is what makes it so interesting. It began the way many deep family rifts begin, in small changes. Shorter conversations. Cooler responses. Mischances? A feeling, more than a fact, that something was no longer easy. And because this was happening inside one of the most watched families in the world, even subtle shifts began to matter. Royal insiders have described that period as one of slow separation. Not chaos. Not screaming. Not open war. Just space. And space, when left alone long enough, can turn into something hard. At first, many people brushed it off. Different personalities, they said. Different ways of handling pressure. Different backgrounds. That seemed believable enough. Catherine had spent years growing into royal life, learning how to move through it with patience and restraint. Meghan entered that same world from a very different direction, carrying her own voice, her own instincts, and her own expectations about honesty, openness, and support. Those differences were always going to matter. What many people don't know is that in a place like the monarchy, personal differences rarely stay personal. They get folded into something bigger. A difference in style becomes a difference in values. A disagreement becomes a question of fit. And before long, people stop asking whether two individuals get along and start asking whether one of them belongs inside the system at all. That is when the story starts to harden. By several accounts, there were moments when things could have gone another way. There were chances, at least in theory, for private understanding, for calm conversations, for some kind of reset. Meetings were reportedly arranged. Communication happened in pieces. There were periods when the public was given the impression that wounds might not be fully healed, but at least not getting worse. Then the distance came back. Again and again. And each time, it seemed a little more settled. That is the pattern people now point to when they talk about this story. Not one single event, but a chain of smaller moments that slowly changed the atmosphere. Observers noticed differences in tone during public appearances. Commentators spoke of a visible lack of ease. People who follow royal body language began doing what they always do, studying who stood where, who looked at whom, who seemed warm, who seemed careful. Maybe some of that was overread. But not all of it. Because over time, the emotional gap started to look structural. That is the phrase that matters here. Once a relationship becomes structural, it stops being only about hurt feelings. It becomes about role, alignment, function. It becomes about who fits the future being built and who does not. And according to many palace watchers, that is exactly what happened. Catherine's position became more and more tied to continuity, stability, discipline, the future image of the monarchy. She was not just living royal life anymore. She was becoming part of the institution's long-term promise to itself. Her every move started carrying that weight. Meghan, by contrast, came to represent something the institution has always struggled with: unpredictability, candor, disruption. Modernity that does not always ask permission before entering the room. That does not automatically make one person right and the other wrong. But it does create tension. And in royal life, tension does not always explode. Sometimes it gets absorbed, managed, pressed flat, hidden under routine until it becomes so normal that people stop expecting warmth at all. That may be the saddest part of this whole story. Because there was a time when the idea of closeness between them was still possible in the public imagination. People wanted to believe that two women standing in difficult positions could find common ground, especially under intense scrutiny. There was hope, early on, that shared pressure might lead to private understanding. Instead, the pressure seemed to push them further apart. Royal correspondents have long suggested that trust was the missing piece. Even when efforts were made, even when the surface looked calm, there was always said to be something unfinished beneath it. Something unspoken. A hesitation that never fully lifted. And once trust weakens, every later moment becomes harder. A conversation is no longer just a conversation. It is a risk. A gesture is no longer just kindness. It can be read as pressure, manipulation, or timing. A phone call is no longer just a phone call. By this point, the divide had grown so familiar that many people around the story stopped talking in emotional language. They no longer framed it as sadness, anger, betrayal. They started using colder words. Alignment, distance, stability, boundaries. That shift matters. Because it suggests the relationship had moved beyond repair attempts and into a more formal kind of separation. Not officially announced, of course. The monarchy rarely works that way. But quietly understood. And still, even then, some people believe there might be one opening left. That is why the reported call mattered so much. Because it arrived after years of this pattern. After all the subtle changes and quiet resets that never held. After the repeated sense that whatever once might have been mended was now being left alone. So when Meghan reportedly reached out, some saw it as the clearest sign yet that she understood the stakes. Not gossip stakes. Not media stakes. Human stakes. The kind that settle in when you realize time has passed, silence has deepened, and if nothing changes soon, nothing may ever change. Then came the moment people cannot stop talking about. The call happened. And Catherine did not answer. On this particular occasion, the power of the moment was not in what happened. It was in what did not happen. No voice on the other end. No exchange. No chance to explain. Just the soundless weight of refusal. According to the version of events that spread through royal commentary, Meghan's call was not casual and not accidental. It was described as emotional, intentional, and possibly the result of serious reflection. People familiar with the atmosphere around the family suggested this was meant to be a last olive branch, one more effort to reach through the distance before it hardened completely. That is why the silence hit so hard. Because if a call comes after years of strain, after long pauses, after smaller attempts that never held, it carries all of that history with it. It is not one moment. It is many moments arriving at once. And by reports circulating around the story, Meghan felt the weight of it fully. Some accounts described her as deeply upset. Others went further and said the refusal triggered a visible emotional collapse. Those details, like much in royal storytelling, remained filtered through unnamed sources and whispered retellings. But the tone across the different versions stayed strikingly similar. This was not treated as a minor disappointment. This was described as devastating. Not because a phone call was missed, but because what it seemed to confirm was unbearable. That any path back might now be closed. That whatever remained unresolved might remain that way forever. That is why the reaction matters. Not because public emotion is unusual, but because the reported emotion here appeared to point backward as much as forward. People watching the story understood immediately that this was bigger than the present moment. It carried years inside it. Years of distance, confusion, competing narratives, failed understandings, and private pain that never found a clean ending. And on the other side stood Catherine, silent and composed. That contrast became the center of the crisis. One side was described as raw, visibly shaken, needing some kind of resolution. The other appeared controlled, measured, and unmoved. Whether those impressions captured the whole truth is impossible to know from outside. But perception shapes royal stories more than almost anything else. And perception, in this case, was brutal. For many observers, Catherine's silence did not look accidental. It looked precise. It looked like someone who had already decided where the boundary was and had no intention of stepping across it. No public explanation followed. No palace correction softened the story. No one emerged to suggest it had all been misunderstood. That absence turned a private episode into a much bigger event. Because once the palace stayed silent, people filled the gap themselves. Media reports, commentators, and royal watchers began assembling the story from fragments, unnamed insiders, repeated whispers, familiar patterns, indirect signals. And with every retelling, the moment took on more meaning. It stopped looking like an awkward family exchange and started looking like a final act in a much longer drama. Some people defended Meghan's reported call as sincere, saying it reflected vulnerability and a real desire for closure. They saw someone trying, perhaps imperfectly, to break a silence that had already done too much damage. Others viewed the move with more suspicion. They questioned the timing. They wondered whether any private gesture involving the royal family can ever remain only private, especially given the intense public narratives that have followed this family for years. That split in reaction only fed the crisis. Because once sincerity and strategy enter the same room, every person watching chooses their own version. Some hear pain. Others hear calculation. Some hear heartbreak. Others hear risk. And in royal matters, where image is everything, those competing readings matter almost as much as the event itself. Then came the palace response, or rather the lack of one. This is where the story became even colder. There was no clear intervention from Kensington Palace. No strong line from Buckingham Palace. No carefully shaped statement to settle the matter. No public pushback saying the reports were false or exaggerated. Just silence. And royal silence is never empty. That is one of the oldest truths in this world. When the palace wants to say little, it still chooses how little. When it wants to redirect attention, it knows how. When it decides not to step into a story, that is usually a decision, not an accident. So for many observers, the institution's refusal to engage did not make the story smaller. It made it feel realer. This was only the beginning. Because once the silence settled, people began reading it not as indifference but as strategy. The monarchy, after all, has always protected itself by staying above personal disputes. It rarely enters emotional arguments directly. It avoids being pulled into mess when it can present itself as the still center holding through chaos. But that same strategy comes with a cost. Silence creates a vacuum. And a vacuum fills fast. Without official words, the public built the meaning themselves. Some interpreted the silence as quiet validation of the reports. Others saw it as a refusal to dignify personal drama with institutional attention. But almost no one saw it as neutral. That is what turned the call into a crisis. Not only because of the reported emotion around it, but because the story seemed to expose something larger about the royal machine. It showed how quickly a deeply human moment can be absorbed into a structure that values stability over explanation, distance over emotional repair, and forward motion over private closure. By then, The refused call had become a symbol. And once a symbol takes hold, facts almost stop being the only point. The full truth was still to come. Because the biggest question was no longer whether Catherine answered. It was what her refusal revealed about the system both women now stood on opposite sides of. By the time the story settled into public conversation, it no longer felt like a story about one call. It felt like a story about the monarchy itself. That is the truth sitting underneath all of this. What unfolded between Meghan and Catherine, as described by journalists, insiders, and longtime royal watchers, looked less and less like a personal misunderstanding and more like the collision of two completely different ways of living. One built around institution, restraint, and survival. The other built around openness, personal voice, and the belief that unresolved pain should be faced, not buried. Once you see the story that way, everything else starts to make sense. Catherine's silence stops looking like mere coldness and starts looking like alignment with the role she now carries. She is not simply a woman managing a difficult family connection. She is also a future queen, and that title changes the meaning of almost every private choice. In royal life, especially at that level, personal comfort often comes second to what protects the institution's long-term image. That can look harsh from the outside. And maybe it is. But within the monarchy, harshness is often renamed discipline. Distance becomes control. Silence becomes strength. That does not make it gentle. It just makes it familiar. Meghan, meanwhile, seems to represent almost the opposite instinct. In the script you provided, she is framed as someone reaching for resolution, not content to let silence stand untouched forever. Whether every whispered detail about her emotional state is fully accurate or not, the larger portrait is clear. She is presented as someone who wanted some kind of answer. Some kind of human exchange, some kind of acknowledgement that all the unspoken history between them still mattered. That is what gives the story its ache. Because if one woman believes pain should be spoken and the other believes survival depends on saying less, then even a simple call becomes impossible to read in just one way. It becomes personal and political at the same time. And that is exactly what royal life does to people. Accounts from commentators and insiders reveal that this is why the refused call felt so final to so many watching from the outside. It was not just that Catherine stayed silent. It was that her silence appeared to confirm the direction everything had already been moving in. No return to easy closeness. No hidden bridge still waiting to be crossed. No quiet path back through private understanding. Just distance, now made unmistakable. Public reaction reflected that feeling. Some people saw the moment as deeply sad, the kind of family fracture that becomes harder to bear precisely because it happens without noise. Others took it as proof that the monarchy will always choose its own protection over emotional honesty. And still others argued that no outsider can truly know what passed between the women, how much had already been attempted in private, or why a boundary may have felt necessary. All of those reactions reveal something. They show how this story touched a nerve beyond celebrity and beyond royal gossip. People were not only reacting to two famous women. They were reacting to familiar human fears. The fear of reaching out too late, the fear of being shut out, the fear that some relationships do not end with truth or peace, but with silence. And in that way, this story became bigger than royalty. It became about the cost of systems. The monarchy survives by being consistent, by choosing continuity even when individual people suffer inside that choice. That has always been its strength. It is also, at times, its cruelty. It does not bend easily. It does not stop to heal every wound. It does not always make room for emotional closure. It endures. That is why the moment feels so cold. Because when stripped of all the speculation, all the commentary, all the palace whispers, what remains is painfully simple. One woman appears to have reached out, and the other did not let her in. Whether that was wise, necessary, heartbreaking, overdue, or all of those things at once depends on who is telling the story. But the emotional shape of it is hard to miss. A final attempt. A fixed boundary. A silence that said enough. And maybe that is why this moment continues to linger. Not because it was loud, but because it was quiet in exactly the way that leaves a mark. Loud moments burn fast. Quiet ones sink in slowly. They keep echoing. They keep making people wonder what was felt, what was feared, what had already been lost before anyone realized it was gone. What many people don't know is that royal stories often become memorable not through confession, but through absence. Through what never gets said. Through what no one corrects. Through the strange power of a blank space left sitting in the middle of public life. That is what happened here. And once that blank space filled with meaning, it became almost impossible to empty again. So where does that leave things now? If the story is read the way many insiders seem to read it, then this was not a temporary freeze. It was a sign of settled reality. Catherine moving forward inside the institution with clear lines around what she will and will not reopen. Meghan standing outside that same institution, carrying a very different view of truth, connection, and what closure should look like. Two women. Two systems. Two languages of survival. And between them, a silence that may never be translated. That is the weight this story leaves behind. Not scandal for the sake of scandal. Not drama just to shock. But a hard reminder that power has a way of changing ordinary human moments. A call becomes a symbol. A refusal becomes history. And silence, in the right setting, becomes the loudest answer of all. These stories provide insight into something people often forget about royal life. The crown may be carried by human beings, but it does not always make room for human needs. And sometimes the first thing sacrificed is not status, but connection.